Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. Today our special guest author is our great friend Father Mitch Pacwa, S.J. His new work is How to Listen When God is Speaking, a guide for modern day Catholics, published by the Word Among Us Press. Welcome, Father Mitch.
Thank you,
friend. Great to have you here.
Good to be here.
It's difficult to get you. You're always so busy between doing your two shows for EWTN, your two live shows, and then, of course, you're doing the radio show as well, and you've got so many other things going on with your Ignatius Productions even, and pilgrimages you go on. You keep pretty busy.
Yes, I do.
So when do you find time to write books?
At night, when I come home from the shows. You know, that I usually will sit at my computer and write at night, try to get an hour or two done.
Now, you've written a fair number of books, but some people, you know, there are priests who have written, 10, 20 books. How many books is it for you?
I think it's 6.
Okay.
6 or 7.
Do you like to write books?
I do. It's a good thing to do. I enjoy using that medium. To me, the issue of writing a book is to use a medium that's going to be helpful for folks about, for various topics. And reading is one that people can use differently than giving a talk. For instance, I'd given some talks on this topic.
Okay.
But people also wanted it written down. So that was one of the issues.
So was the genesis of this the fact that you gave some talks and saw an opportunity that this could be put into a book?
Right.
Because that does happen many times.
Exactly.
Retreat masters will go in and consolidate it into a book. Right?
Exactly. And so I gave the talk a few times and saw that it needed expansion, and so wanted to write a book on it.
When you go out and give a talk like that, let alone writing a book, after you give it the first time, do you go back and say what worked, what didn't work,
Exactly.
so that over a period of time you've honed it?
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Because the first time you give a talk, as a matter of fact, with the talk that was behind this, I went to give a retreat, and I prepared one topic, and I found out that it was the wrong topic, so I had to wing it. But because of my background in the Society of Jesus, the issue of discernment is one that is very important in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And so I was able to draw on that experience and then after a while hone that talk down and then give it again in both audio form and written form. Okay.
Now, you mentioned the Society of Jesus, which you were a member, though you obviously stay here at EWTN and do the programs for EWTN.
Yeah, my provincial has missioned me here. He made that very clear that this is where he has sent me to be on.
So when I noticed in here, there's a Timothy P. Kasicki.
Yes.
And I noticed he had some, it's not an imprimatur. What is it, an imprimi?
Imprimi potest.
What does that mean?
Father Kasicki is my provincial.
Okay.
And as such, he's my ordinary. Instead of, I'm not under a bishop.
Okay,
right.
So
I'm under a provincial.
Okay.
And so he cannot give the imprimatur because he doesn't have that church authority. A bishop has that. But he gives us Jesuits the imprimi potest, which means it is able to be printed.
Okay.
So he gives the permission to print books, and I have to go through the provincial.
Right. So if they didn't approve it, it couldn't be printed.
It can't be published.
Okay. And that's part of being part of the society.
Exactly.
Right. And obedience is a big part of being in a
Absolutely.
religious order. Right.
In fact, that's part of the issue here. With legitimate authority, when legitimate authority says something, that part of discernment is not to disobey. You can use all of the means to give your own position to the authority. You can make a representation for whatever it is that you wanted to do. But when they say no, then it's important to go along with that no answer. Somehow God is going to be working through that no answer as well.
Even if you don't understand it at the time.
Even if you don't understand it.
You have to put faith that is the right answer.
Right.
Now, you say this is a guide for modern day Catholics. So is this a book that wouldn't have been useful for people 30 or 40 years ago? What makes it specific for today?
I try to address some of the issues that we have in the church today. The church is going through a variety of changes. And many of them are caused by the situation that we have in society at large. Mm-hmm. So we're, interacting with the rest of the modern world. And we've gone through a period in which the post-World War II atheism and agnosticism have been very important. And now we're in a period where the media has taken a role that it never had prior. I mean, radio was out there before the World War and was important, but the rest of the media, the television and the internet, have come into play in new ways so that we trust them for a lot more information than we would trust, say, in the church. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to deal with that situation. Mm-hmm. Why would modern people who get their news on a 24-hour cycle, and why would they, who can say, I don't even trust the news, I want to go to the internet, why would they try to discern the will of God when there's so much incoming information? Right. So that's one of the changes about modern-day Catholics that I want to address.
Well, you say here, why would modern people want to listen to God speaking to them? And you say, so the decision to listen to God speaking to us is radical and life-changing. When I hear things like radical, I think of the 60s and the 70s, but we're dealing with some of the fallout from that radicalism. How is this different?
Radical comes from a word meaning to go to the root. Erotics is a root. And it's radical in the sense that it goes to a root difference between the way you react in the world. Are you going to act on the basis of what God wants, or are you going to go by what the culture says? And those are two very distinct ways of reacting. And so that's what I meant by radical.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the idea of listening to God, and you talk about how do we learn to listen to God, but you also say that if you do, He will definitely challenge us. His words and actions in the gospel will challenge our instincts to be self-centered or to focus on our own personal pleasure or the acquisition of property and power. He will challenge those habits of sin that we too easily rationalize. Isn't that the reason most people don't want to listen to God? Because they're afraid that will happen to them?
Exactly. And one of the things that I've noticed, I've observed some of the themes of modern comedies. I contrast the comedies of the 1950s, which I well remember,
sure.
and in the 60s, with the modern comedies of the 90s and the new millennium. And the theme of the comedies today is egocentric narcissism, that the jokes are on how egocentric the characters are and how they get caught in their egocentrism and just say, whatever, and go on with their lives in an egocentric way. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to address this question that's also part of the modern world, that if the humor is about egocentrism, it means it's touching something that's in the culture. There's an element of people saying, well, I just do what I want, and the heck with anybody else, including God.
Well, if you want to do that, then you purely have to get rid of the notion of God, or at least figure that God is a projection of your own will in some way, that He just kind of thinks I'm a nice guy and is very happy with what I'm doing. In chapter 1, you say, first things first, and you talk about 3 things we need to affirm from the beginning. We can talk about what those are, but you also say one of the reasons why it may be difficult to hear God in the modern world is that we often hear people in our secular culture disagree with these basic principles. What are they?
There are a number of basic principles. First of all, that God exists. That, as you mentioned already, do you believe that God exists and that God is knowable? And, that's a second principle, that God knows us. And thirdly, that God wants us to know Him. These are some basic issues in terms of discerning God's will. If you don't believe that God exists, or you don't believe that you can know God, or that God wants you to know Him, then you're not even going to start on the journey. And so this is something very basic, and that there's a plan that God has for us. This is one of the things that you find out then as God becomes knowable, that God has a plan, that He wants us to go to heaven and avoid hell. I mean, that sounds so basic, But it's not. In these self-centered comedies, they oftentimes will joke that, well, of course they're going to hell, but that's where my friends are. Mm-hmm. And the thing they don't realize is that your friends may well be in hell. Mm-hmm. However, you won't be friends anymore.
Right.
You'll hate them, and they'll hate you.
Well, you say there's no camaraderie or something
exactly.
like that in hell.
There's no camaraderie and friendship in hell.
Right.
That the demons hate each other, mm-hmm. and they hate everyone else, and there's no love. So, what you think is a camaraderie mm-hmm. is not there.
Right.
And people need to realize that and say, I don't want to go and to hell. I don't want to be there. I want to be in heaven. That's where God wants me. And God wants me infinitely more to be in heaven than even I want to be there.
Well, you mentioned the fact in the book, you talk about the idea that it's actually a good idea, or why it's a good idea, for people to think about hell. Now, let alone think about it, most people don't believe in it, or if they believe in it, they don't think anybody's in there.
Right. And this is one of the problems. With that narcissistic culture, the idea that actions have consequences is diminished. Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't think that their bad behavior has real consequences for them or anybody else, and they don't want to deal with the consequences of their behavior. Those consequences not only affect what I can see around me. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I cannot see how my behavior affects other people.
Or at least initially. You don't see it, right? Many times.
It's like the kid who says, hey, I tried smoking, nothing happened to me, I didn't get cancer. Well, that's because you don't get cancer from smoking when you're a kid. Right. You get it when you're 50.
Right.
And so this is one of an example of how people don't see the consequences of their behavior right away.
Well, do you think also sometimes with people today, it's either the fact that it's not my fault because I didn't mean it to hurt anybody.
Exactly.
So I can't be held accountable. Or it's somebody else's fault because I was raised a certain way or misled. But certainly I'm not accountable for any of this.
And that's one of the things that I want to get at here. When I choose to do behavior, it is not my parents' fault. Mm-hmm. They may have influenced me by training me poorly. And they may have an influence on me because I'm reacting against them. That's possible. But I'm still the one who made the choice. And that's what discernment is about. Mm-hmm. Discernment is about saying, I make choices and I am responsible before God. I've got free will. Mm-hmm. That's one of the basics that we try to get at. I've got free will, and I can choose to go along with a flow that will lead to my narcissism and egocentrism. Or I can go against that and try to seek what is it that God wants for my life.
Well, you say that you fall into two main categories, choices that is. The first category is a choice between a moral good versus a moral evil. And the second category is a choice between two things that are morally good.
Right. For instance, one of the basic principles of discernment is that, I mentioned, if God is knowable, as we said at the beginning, then one of the things that's knowable is his will about what is right and wrong. In our narcissistic culture, people don't want to hear that something is evil. As a matter of fact, this is one of the things that goes on in a lot of schools. One of my guests on Dr. Ray Guarendi had said,
been on this program as well.
Right. He has talked about how in the modern school system, you don't say that was bad. Mm-hmm. You say that was not acceptable because you focus on the ego. It's not acceptable to me, so you should not do it. Mm-hmm. Whereas God is willing to say quite clearly, this is good, this is evil. Mm-hmm. And this, as a matter of fact, that choice you see in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Choose life and good or death and evil. Mm-hmm. And going against God's 10 commandments, for instance, or going against Christ's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, and other moral sections of the New Testament and Old Testament, is itself a bad. And so before one can even start to discern God's will. One has to be willing to say, I want to avoid what God calls bad and do what God calls good. That's a basic choice. And avoid evil, choose good. This is basic. Secondly, you then have choices that are two goods. For instance, when I was a young man, I had a choice. I could be a priest. I could be a Jesuit priest. I could be a diocesan priest. I could be a Jesuit brother. I could be married, all of which are goods. There's nothing wrong with any one of those. How do I know which one of those I should choose? And which one does God want me to choose? That's where the issue of discernment comes in. And we try to give principles for helping people to discern the will of God.
Let me ask you about that, because later in the book you talk about in two different sections. One, you talk about, what was a bigger obstacle for you being a Jesuit? Was it teaching at a high school or going to see Gone with the Wind?
One, I would put it this way. Because there's a story in there that I went to see Gone with the Wind with the girl I was dating before I joined the Jesuits. And I was swept up by the feelings that all these marriages were so beautiful. And I actually turned toward her to propose marriage. And I stopped myself and said, you better think about this just a little bit more. I had that much self-awareness. And thought about it. And I was in the process of applying to the Jesuits, but I had not heard back from them yet.
Okay.
So, in one sense, I was tempted to follow my feelings without reflecting on what was the deeper feeling. Where was the real peace at? One was an excitement. There was an excitement about all these marriages because it was so beautiful. There was a re-release of Gone with the Wind that came out in '68. And, I guess it was an anniversary release or something. And that feeling, that emotion, was something that was easy to sweep one away and into a decision.
Is that what a lot of people do today?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And have done throughout the centuries. That's not new. That's not modern. That's human. Because we find there's a peace with that. And that's one of the things that, about discernment. You're looking for what is going to give peace, but what's going to give the more lasting peace. And as I went back and thought about that, and, that gave me a certain amount of peace. But as I thought about it, I'd wanted to be a priest since I was 8. And that was a deeper, more lasting peace. Something that had been for 10 years of my life at that point, 10, 11 years of my life. And so I really had to rethink that and follow what gave me deeper peace.
Right.
Whereas when I went to the high school to teach, that was the one time I thought about leaving the Jesuits. But it's not because I found something I wanted to do better. It's because I was miserable. I was very unhappy teaching high school. I didn't particularly like doing the discipline that you have to do in a high school. I didn't know how to relate well to high school students. I wanted to teach college. And this was a difficult experience because I had no clue about what I was doing. And there I felt a real desolation. Now, both of these are good examples of how the various movements of desolation and consolation work. And as I reflected on that experience of desolation while I was teaching high school, I remembered one event in particular. When I was a novice, we made a 30-day retreat in silence. And during that 30-day retreat, I found one of the most profound experiences of God's peace at the choice of being a Jesuit priest. And I had to remember that experience and say, I can't let this experience of desolation undo the peace that I felt when I made my election to be a Jesuit. And so that was a more real experience of peace than was my experience of desolation. Secondly, St. Ignatius Loyola, and I give some of the rules for discernment in
chapter 3, the movements in our souls.
Right, because we have to pay attention to both the external and the internal movements. What's going on externally, what's going on internally. And internally, St. Ignatius gives us one of the rules for discernment, that you never change a decision that you had made when you were in a state of peace.
Right.
Don't change that decision when you feel desolation.
Right. I thought that really struck me.
Yeah, that's one of the really basic rules. Just because you're unhappy, that's no reason to change a decision you made when you were at a deep sense of peace. That's the last time you should ever make a decision about peace.
Right, and that's in fact in the chapter on page chapter 3, 58 and 59, which actually I pulled that question about your own situation teaching at the high school. Now, one of the things you've also done in this book is you've actually broken it up into multiple chapters, obviously, but you actually put like reflection questions at the end of each chapter. Is that because you see this as can be used for a study group, or is it just for a personal?
That this it can be used both ways. An individual can take a look at some of those study questions and use that to reflect on his or her own private life. But a group of people, now one of the problems that we have is there are not enough spiritual directors.
Right.
Priests tend to be overwhelmed. There aren't that many of us, and there's a lot of work to do. And people are very frustrated that there aren't more spiritual directors. But there's only 24 hours a day and only 7 days a week. And so this is something that's very difficult for priests to do. And nuns have the same problem. They have their regular work to do, plus try to do spiritual direction. So this is one of those things where a group of people can help each other with spiritual direction. And reflecting on some of these questions might be a way for a group to do a study on discernment and then form a group that helps one another with spiritual direction. I think that can work in a number of circumstances. Also, I have a strong sense that a lot of times married couples do spiritual direction for each other. If a couple is prayerful together and as individuals, then they can help each other with discernment. This book would be a great help for married couples to learn how to discern what it is they should do as a family and as individuals within the family.
In chapter 4, Preparing Our Hearts, you say, the experience of desolation is not unusual when people ignore, defend, or even embrace those sinful aspects of their lives that separate them from God. And then you go on to say, God does not want a person to feel comfortable with acts of violence, adultery, lust, stealing, jealousy, or any other degradation of the human person. And so you're saying God likes us to feel guilty?
Yes, he does, when we're guilty. And this is one of the things that goes strongly against some of the mood of the culture. There was a time when people wanted you to feel shame and guilt. When the society had an agreed set of morals, then everybody would click their tongues at bad behavior. And this would be a normal thing. Today, we have a relativistic culture where you can't say that your right is my right or your wrong is my wrong. I've got my values, you've got your values, and we can't discuss it. Well, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is God does have an opinion about whether you're right or wrong. And he is going to be correct in that determination of right and wrong. And he wants us to experience guilt when we're guilty. Now, it's important to distinguish that from false guilt. There's an emotional guilt that people feel. Sometimes it's confusing regret. When you feel a certain amount of regret for a sin you've already confessed, and you don't know how to get over the regret. There are other issues that have to be addressed there. For instance, one of the things that some people need to do is do acts of reparation. And that their guilt feeling has nothing to do with the fact of their actual guilt, because their guilt has been forgiven. And they should have a sense of peace. but they may need to do an act of reparation. I think of an example of a person who came to me for counseling after having had an abortion. And in that, the woman wanted to kill somebody in order to go to jail because she felt guilty.
Felt that she was.
And I said, this is not a healthy way to deal with your guilt feelings. A much better way would be to go to this hospital in Chicago that dealt with crack babies. These babies needed to be held and comforted as they come off of the crack addiction that they were born with. Well, that will help do reparation for what you did. You'll be helping babies, and this will make up for it. And I guarantee you that her guilt would go away.
Now, on page 147, under a larger plan, I'm thinking about this in relation to you. You talk about a really harrowing experience where you were basically held up by a drug gang and your friend was killed in front of you.
Right.
And you had nightmares after that.
Right.
Was any of that guilt?
I'm sure that an element, there are two elements going on after I saw my friend killed. One was fright, because they did come looking for me.
Okay.
So it wasn't neurosis. They came. There was another guy there. They came and they shot him, and they were looking for me. So I had to leave Chicago and go to another city. So there was just real fright going on. And then the second thing was survivor's guilt. That
Right.
Why did I survive and my friend Jimmy didn't? Right. This was one of the things that you don't understand, and I had to learn to deal with, and realize that ultimately the way I dealt with it is that there was a mystery involved in this, and apparently I still had things that God wanted me to do.
Right, but it also put you kind of on a detour through the New Age movement, so it actually got
Yes.
you off course for a little while.
It did. This is one of the things. Just because something is bad
Right.
doesn't and can help you,
Right.
that doesn't mean that it helps you right away. And
Right.
because I started reading Carl Jung, I talk about that in my first book, Catholics in the New Age. I started reading Carl Jung in order to understand my dreams better. Right. And I ended up getting into New Age ideas because Jung was very New Agey before it was.
Well, we are going to go into the next stage if we let this go any longer. Thank you so much, Father Mitch. We're just out of time. Pleasure to have you here on the program and, of course, on EWTN, speaking with the one and only Father Mitch Pacwa, S.J., author of How to Listen When God is Speaking, a guide for modern-day Catholics, published by the Word Among Us Press, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. You should check this book out. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.